In the spring of 1853, Eleanor Ashford signed manumission papers freeing a man named Marcus from bondage at her family plantation in Caroline County, Virginia. That alone would have been noteworthy. A wealthy, unmarried woman of 28 voluntarily freeing a prime field hand worth $1,500 raised eyebrows throughout the county. But what Eleanor did 3 days later would have destroyed her family's reputation entirely if anyone had known about it. She married Marcus in a secret ceremony, witnessed only by Marcus's sister, a woman named Grace, who kept the secret for 6 months before everything fell apart. When Eleanor's brother, Thomas Ashford, discovered the marriage in November of 1853, he could have simply exposed Eleanor and had the marriage annulled. Virginia law prohibited interracial marriage with penalties including imprisonment and public whipping. Instead, Thomas made Eleanor an offer she found impossible to refuse. He would keep her secret. He would not destroy her reputation or prosecute her under Virginia law. But in exchange, Eleanor would have to prove her loyalty to her family and her race by personally hunting Marcus through the woods of Ashford Plantation while 12 men watched. If Marcus survived until dawn, he would go free with enough money to start a life in the North. If he did not survive, his death would serve as Eleanor's penance, and her secret would remain buried. Eleanor agreed. The hunt took place on November 23, 1853. It began at midnight. Marcus did not survive until dawn. What Eleanor did to his body in the hours after his death shocked even the men who had organized the hunt. And what Marcus's sister Grace did over the following 17 years, the systematic campaign of revenge she waged against everyone involved, became the darkest secret in Caroline County history. The official records say nothing about any of this. There are no court documents, no newspaper accounts, no mentions in family histories preserved at the Caroline County Historical Society. But the stories survived in other ways. In letters passed down through families, in journals hidden in attic trunks and discovered decades later, in testimony given by formerly enslaved people to Freedmen's Bureau officials after the Civil War, and most damningly, in a leather-bound book discovered in 1927 during demolition of the old Ashford mansion, a book containing detailed accounts of 7 hunts conducted at various plantations throughout Virginia between 1848 and 1856, including precise descriptions of the hunt that killed Marcus. Before we continue with this story, if you are hearing this and it is making your skin crawl, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now. This channel dives deep into the darkest corners of American history, the stories they do not teach in schools, the secrets buried in courthouse basements and forgotten records. And I want to know where you are listening from. Drop a comment telling me what state or city you are in. Are you from Virginia? Does your family have connections to Caroline County? Do you know stories like this from your own area? Let's find out together. Now, let us go back to where it all began, to a cold February morning in 1852, when Eleanor Ashford first noticed something different about a man named Marcus. Caroline County, Virginia, in 1852 was tobacco country. The soil was rich but demanding. The society was built on a foundation of enslaved labor that had existed for over 200 years. Families like the Ashfords had been planting tobacco since the 1600s, accumulating wealth and land and human beings with each generation. By 1852, Ashford Plantation encompassed 1,200 acres worked by 83 enslaved people. The main house was brick, 3 stories, built in 1798 by Eleanor's grandfather. It sat on a small rise overlooking the Mattapony River, surrounded by formal gardens that Eleanor's mother had planted before dying of fever in 1839. Eleanor had been 13 when her mother died. Her father, William Ashford, had been a distant man who spent most of his time in Richmond conducting business and left the plantation management to his son Thomas. William died in 1848 when Eleanor was 23, leaving Thomas, then 29, as head of the family. Thomas had married well, a Charleston woman named Victoria who brought a dowry of $5,000 and impeccable social connections. They had 2 children by 1852 and lived in the main house with Eleanor, who remained unmarried despite Thomas's regular attempts to arrange suitable matches. Eleanor had refused 4 marriage proposals between 1846 and 1851. Each refusal made her more difficult to place. By 28, she was considered past prime marrying age, too educated for her own good, and stubbornly independent in ways that made men uncomfortable. She read extensively, spoke French, handled much of the plantation correspondence, and had opinions about politics that she did not always keep to herself. Thomas found her exhausting. Victoria found her threatening. Both wished she would simply accept the next reasonable offer and move to another man's household. Marcus had been born on Ashford Plantation in 1827, making him 25 years old in 1852. His mother had died when he was young. His father had been sold to a Mississippi plantation when Marcus was 12, a sale that Marcus had watched from the doorway of the cabin he would never see his father again. Marcus worked in the fields but had been trained in carpentry and was often pulled from tobacco work to handle construction and repair projects around the plantation. He was tall, quiet, and known for being reliable. Overseers liked him because he caused no trouble. Other enslaved people trusted him because he was steady and would help anyone who needed it. Eleanor first spoke to Marcus in February of 1852 when she needed bookshelves built in the library. Thomas had assigned Marcus to the work. Eleanor spent 3 afternoons in the library while Marcus measured and cut and assembled the shelves. She had intended to simply supervise the work, but found herself talking to him. Not the usual commands given to enslaved workers, but actual conversation. She asked about his carpentry skills, where he had learned them, what he thought about different wood types, and construction methods. Marcus answered carefully at first, aware that any interaction with a white woman carried danger. But Eleanor seemed genuinely interested, not testing him, and gradually he relaxed enough to speak naturally. What struck Eleanor was his intelligence. Marcus thought deeply about his work, considered problems from multiple angles, explained his reasoning with clarity that suggested education despite having no formal schooling. She asked how he had learned to think so precisely. Marcus hesitated, then admitted that an older enslaved man named Joseph had taught him to read when he was young, before Joseph was sold away. Reading had opened Marcus's mind to ideas and ways of thinking that transformed how he approached everything, even carpentry. That admission was dangerous. Teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in Virginia. Admitting to literacy could result in severe punishment. But Marcus had sensed something in Eleanor, some quality that made him believe the risk was worth taking. He was right. Eleanor said nothing to anyone. Instead, she began leaving books in the library where Marcus was working, casually mentioning that she had finished reading them and they could be borrowed if anyone was interested. Marcus understood. He borrowed 3 books that first month. They never discussed the books directly, but Eleanor would sometimes make comments that showed she knew he had read them, questions about characters or ideas, observations that invited response without demanding it. Over the following months, their conversations deepened. Marcus would be assigned to various projects around the house, repair work, or furniture construction, and Eleanor would find reasons to be present. They talked about books, about ideas, about the world beyond Caroline County. Eleanor shared her frustration at being trapped in a life that offered her no real choices, married off to control property or left to wither as an unmarried dependent in her brother's house. Marcus shared what it meant to live as property, to have no control over anything, to watch family members sold away, to know that any moment of happiness existed only at the whim of someone who owned you. They were both trapped, Eleanor said one afternoon in August of 1852. Their cages looked different, but they were both prisoners of a system that denied them autonomy. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, aware that what he said next could change everything or end everything. "The difference," he said quietly, "is that you could leave. You have money, education, family connections. You could go to another state, start over, live however you wanted. I will die on this plantation unless I am sold away to die on another one. Those are my only options." Eleanor had no response to that. Marcus was right. Her cage had a door she could theoretically open. His did not. The realization shamed her. She had been so focused on her own limitations that she had not fully grasped the fundamental difference between limited choices and no choices at all. That night, Eleanor lay awake thinking about Marcus, about their conversations, about the person she had come to know over 6 months. She was thinking about him as a person, not as property, and that shift in perspective changed everything. By October of 1852, Eleanor had admitted to herself what she had been avoiding for months. She had fallen in love with Marcus. The thought was impossible, dangerous, and completely real. She did not know if Marcus felt the same way. She could not simply ask him. Any expression of romantic interest from her would place him in an impossible position. If he reciprocated, he risked his life. If he refused, he risked offending her with potential consequences. She had to find a way to communicate her feelings, while giving him complete freedom to reject them safely. She solved the problem with a letter. She wrote it carefully, expressing her feelings clearly but also making it absolutely explicit that Marcus was under no obligation to respond, that rejection would carry no consequences, that their friendship would continue unchanged if he did not share her feelings, and that she would never mention the letter again if he preferred to pretend it had never been written. She left the letter in a book she knew Marcus would borrow, tucked in the middle pages where no one else would find it if he chose to simply ignore it. 3 days passed with no response. Eleanor began to believe Marcus had decided to ignore the letter entirely. Then she found his response, written on a scrap of paper and hidden in the same book. Marcus's handwriting was careful and deliberate. His letter was shorter than hers but equally clear. He had feelings for her. He had been fighting those feelings for months, knowing they were dangerous. He wanted to believe something might be possible between them, but he could not imagine how. The system that separated them was not something they could simply ignore or overcome through feeling alone. Eleanor's response was practical. She laid out a plan. She would manumit Marcus, legally freeing him. Once free, Marcus could theoretically leave Virginia, but instead, he would stay hidden on plantation property. Eleanor owned a small cabin in the woods, 2 miles from the main house, a place her grandfather had built for hunting trips. The cabin had not been used in years and was nearly forgotten. Marcus could live there. Eleanor would bring supplies, food, books, everything he needed. They would have time together, time to determine if what they felt was real or just the product of impossible circumstances, time to decide what, if anything, they wanted to do next. Marcus pointed out the obvious problems with this plan. If he was discovered, he would likely be killed. If Eleanor was discovered, she would be disgraced and possibly prosecuted. If they were discovered together, both outcomes would occur. But Eleanor had already decided the risk was worthwhile. She was 28 years old, unmarried, and staring at a future of slow decline in her brother's household. If she did nothing, she would eventually be married off to whoever would still take her, probably an older widower looking for someone to manage his household. She would live in quiet desperation until she died. At least, this risk offered the possibility of something real, something chosen, something that belonged to her and no one else. Marcus agreed. What choice did he really have? Refuse and continue as he was, enslaved and trapped, or accept and have at least a chance at something different, even if that chance was small and dangerous? In December of 1852, Eleanor filed manumission papers with the Caroline County Courthouse. The paperwork stated that Marcus had performed exceptional service and was being freed as a reward for his loyalty and skill. It cost Eleanor $300 in processing fees and required posted notice for 30 days to allow any creditors to object. No objections were filed. On January 15th, 1853, Marcus became legally free. Thomas Ashford was not pleased. He questioned Eleanor's judgment, suggested she was being sentimental and foolish, pointed out that Marcus was worth $1,500 as a worker, and now that value was simply lost. Eleanor said she had her own money inherited from their father and could dispose of it as she wished. Thomas argued, but ultimately accepted it. Women sometimes did foolish things. This was foolish, but not scandalous. Marcus would presumably leave Virginia, and that would be the end of it. Except Marcus did not leave. He was seen around the plantation for a few days after his manumission, saying goodbye to people he had known his entire life. Then he disappeared. Most assumed he had gone north to Philadelphia or New York, where free black communities offered some safety and opportunity. No one suspected he was 2 miles away, living in a forgotten hunting cabin, waiting for Eleanor. Eleanor visited the cabin for the first time on January 20th, 1853. She brought supplies, food, blankets, candles, firewood. She also brought books and writing materials. She stayed for 2 hours, talking with Marcus about what came next, what they were doing, what it meant. When she left, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt alive. She felt like she was making her own choices rather than simply accepting what others decided for her. Over the following weeks, Eleanor visited the cabin regularly. She told her family she was taking long walks for her health, which was not entirely untrue. She would leave mid-afternoon when Thomas was in the fields and Victoria was occupied with the children. She would walk through the woods to the cabin, spend 2 or 3 hours with Marcus, then return before anyone noticed her absence. They talked, they read together, they planned impossible futures, and, inevitably, their relationship deepened beyond conversation. In late February of 1853, Eleanor proposed marriage. She knew it was illegal, she knew it was dangerous, but she wanted something to mark what they were to each other, some acknowledgement that this was more than an affair or a scandal. Marcus pointed out that marriage would make everything more dangerous, would create evidence of a crime rather than just a secret relationship. Eleanor said she did not care. She wanted to marry him, properly, with vows and witnesses, even if that marriage could never be legally recognized. The ceremony took place on March 7th, 1853, in the hunting cabin. The only witness was Grace, Marcus's older sister, who still lived in the quarters at Ashford Plantation. Grace had been terrified when Marcus told her he was marrying Eleanor, convinced it would get them all killed. But she loved her brother and understood that he had made his choice. She came to the cabin on a cold Sunday afternoon when most people were at church services. Eleanor had written out vows. Marcus had carved 2 simple rings from walnut wood. Grace stood as witness while Eleanor and Marcus promised to love and honor each other for as long as they lived. There was no minister, no legal authority, nothing that would make the marriage valid in any legal sense, but it was real to them. And that was what mattered. For 6 months, they made it work. Eleanor visited the cabin 3 or 4 times each week. She brought food and supplies, and herself. Marcus stayed hidden, reading the books Eleanor brought, working on small carpentry projects, using tools she had smuggled from the plantation workshops, and waiting for the hours when Eleanor would arrive. It was not a real life. It was a stolen life, a secret life, a life built on concealment and constant fear of discovery. But it was theirs, and for 6 months, it was enough. Grace visited Marcus regularly as well, bringing news from the quarters, checking on her brother, making sure he had what he needed. She was taking a terrible risk. If anyone discovered she was visiting the cabin, questions would follow. But family was family, and Grace had already lost her father to a sail that sent him to Mississippi. She would not lose her brother to isolation and loneliness if she could help it. The discovery came on November 3rd, 1853. Thomas Ashford had been hunting deer in the woods south of the main house. He had tracked a wounded buck for over a mile, following blood spatter through underbrush and across small streams. The buck's trail led him to an area he rarely visited, the old hunting lands where his grandfather's cabin stood. Thomas was surprised to see smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. Someone was living there, using Ashford property without permission. Thomas approached carefully, his rifle ready. Poachers sometimes used abandoned structures as temporary shelter. He would run them off, and that would be the end of it. But as he got closer, he saw something that stopped him cold. Through the cabin window, he saw Eleanor. His sister was inside the cabin, sitting at a rough wooden table, talking to someone Thomas could not see from his angle. Thomas moved around the cabin until he had a better view. The person Eleanor was talking to was Marcus, the man she had freed 10 months earlier, the man everyone assumed had left Virginia. Thomas watched for several minutes, trying to understand what he was seeing. Eleanor and Marcus were sitting close together, comfortable in a way that suggested long familiarity. As Thomas watched, Eleanor reached out and took Marcus's hand. Marcus lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it. The gesture was tender, intimate, and completely clear in its meaning. Thomas felt ice flood through him. His sister was not just talking to a freed slave. She was involved with him, romantically involved, in a way that suggested this had been going on for some time. Thomas could have confronted them immediately, could have burst through the door with his rifle and ended everything in violence. But Thomas was not an impulsive man. He was calculating, methodical, someone who thought through consequences before acting. He backed away from the cabin quietly and made his way back to the main house. He needed to think. He needed to decide how to handle this situation in a way that protected his family's reputation while also ensuring the problem was permanently resolved. That evening, Thomas said nothing to Eleanor about what he had seen. He ate dinner with his family, discussed plantation business with his overseer, and acted completely normal. But his mind was working through options, through possibilities, through solutions. By the time he went to bed, he had decided on a course of action. It was brutal, but it would accomplish everything he needed. It would punish Eleanor for her transgression. It would eliminate Marcus permanently, and it would ensure that no scandal ever touched the Ashford family name. The next morning, Thomas summoned Eleanor to his study. When she arrived, he closed the door and told her what he had seen. Eleanor's face went white. She started to speak, to deny or explain, but Thomas cut her off. He did not want explanations. He wanted compliance. He laid out the situation clearly. Eleanor had committed a crime under Virginia law. She had married a man of color, an act punishable by imprisonment and public whipping. If Thomas reported her to authorities, she would be prosecuted, and the scandal would destroy the Ashford reputation forever. But Thomas did not want that. He did not want his sister imprisoned or publicly whipped. He did not want the family name dragged through courts and newspapers. So he was offering Eleanor a choice. She could refuse his offer, in which case he would immediately report her to the county sheriff and let the legal process proceed. Or she could accept his offer and the matter would be resolved privately with no public scandal. "What was the offer?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely steady. Thomas explained. "There was a tradition among certain plantation families," he said. "A tradition that was never discussed publicly, but was practiced more often than people might think. When situations arose that required resolution outside normal legal channels, when property disputes or personal conflicts needed settling without involving authorities, some families organized private hunts. A person was given a head start and then tracked through designated territory. If the person reached a specified boundary before being caught, they went free. If they were caught, well, that resolved the problem. Thomas proposed such a hunt for Marcus. The hunt would take place on Ashford land, in the woods south of the plantation where the cabin was located. Marcus would be given a head start of 1 hour after midnight. He would need to reach the northern boundary of Ashford property, approximately 4 miles from the cabin, before dawn. If he made it, he would be given $100 and allowed to leave Virginia unmolested. If he did not make it, he would be killed, and the matter would be closed. But there was one more condition, Thomas said. Eleanor would participate in the hunt. She would be given a rifle, and she would hunt Marcus alongside the other men Thomas would invite. She would prove her loyalty to her family and her race by personally participating in the destruction of the man she had betrayed them for. If she refused, Thomas would report her to authorities immediately. Eleanor sat in silence, staring at her brother. She asked if this was truly happening, if Thomas was truly asking her to hunt and kill the man she loved. Thomas said he was not asking. He was telling her what would happen. She had 48 hours to decide, accept the terms and prepare for the hunt, or refuse and face prosecution. Those were her only options. For 2 days, Eleanor barely functioned. She could not eat, could not sleep, could not think of anything except the impossible choice Thomas had forced on her. She considered running. She and Marcus could flee together, leave Virginia, go north or west, disappear into the territories where no one knew them. But Thomas had anticipated that possibility. He had arranged for men to watch the cabin. Any attempt by Eleanor or Marcus to leave would result in immediate apprehension and prosecution. She considered fighting. She could refuse Thomas's offer, force him to report her, let the scandal happen. But that would not save Marcus. He would still be killed, probably by Thomas himself or by men Thomas hired, and Eleanor would be imprisoned, unable to help or protect or avenge him. At least if she accepted Thomas's terms, she would be present for whatever happened. Perhaps she could find a way to help Marcus escape during the hunt. Perhaps something would go wrong with Thomas's plan, and an opportunity would present itself. On the evening of November 5th, 1853, Eleanor told Thomas she accepted his terms. Thomas nodded, satisfied. He had already begun making arrangements. He had sent messages to 11 other men, plantation owners and overseers from neighboring properties, men who shared Thomas's views and could be trusted to participate and remain silent. The hunt would take place on November 23rd, giving everyone time to prepare. Thomas would handle the logistics. Eleanor needed only to be ready. Thomas also insisted that Eleanor be the one to tell Marcus what was going to happen. She needed to go to the cabin, explain the situation, and give Marcus his options. He could agree to participate in the hunt, or he could refuse, in which case Thomas would simply have him killed immediately. The hunt at least gave him a chance, however small. Marcus's choice would reveal what kind of man he truly was. A coward would refuse and beg for mercy. A man of courage would accept the challenge and fight for his survival. Eleanor went to the cabin that evening. She told Marcus everything. She watched his face as she explained about Thomas discovering them, about the hunt, about the terms. Marcus listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, she waited for his response. She half expected rage or panic or accusations that she had betrayed him. Instead, Marcus asked a single question. Would Thomas keep his word? If Marcus reached the boundary before dawn, would he truly be allowed to leave? Eleanor said she did not know. She did not trust her brother. But there would be other men present, witnesses who would hold Thomas accountable to the stated terms. If Marcus reached the boundary, Thomas would likely honor the agreement rather than risk word spreading that he had violated the rules of the hunt. Marcus nodded slowly. Then I accept. I will run, I will fight, and maybe I will survive. Eleanor asked if he hated her, if he blamed her for bringing this on him. Marcus took her hand. You did not bring this on me. The system brought this on me. I was never safe. I was never free. Not really. At least this way, I have a chance, and if I die having known what it felt like to be loved by someone who chose me, who saw me as a man rather than as property. That is more than most enslaved people ever get. They spent that night together in the cabin, perhaps their last night ever. They did not speak much. There was nothing left to say. They simply held each other, trying to memorize the feeling, storing up warmth against the cold that was coming. Over the following 2 weeks, Thomas made his preparations. He sent letters to the 11 men he had invited, explaining the situation in vague terms that protected Eleanor's identity, while making clear what was being offered. A hunt, a challenge, entertainment for men who appreciated such things. 9 of the 11 accepted immediately. The remaining two declined, not from moral objection, but from prior commitments. Thomas replaced them with 2 other men, ensuring he would have 12 participants for the hunt. He also scouted the territory, mapping out the 4-mile stretch from the cabin to the northern boundary. The land was heavily wooded, cut through with streams and ravines, thick with underbrush. Good hunting country. It would be challenging enough to make the hunt interesting, but not so difficult that Marcus would have an easy escape. Thomas also positioned 3 men at the northern boundary as insurance. If Marcus somehow made it past the hunters, these 3 would be waiting to ensure he did not actually reach freedom. Eleanor spent those 2 weeks in a fog. She went through the motions of daily life but felt disconnected from everything. Victoria noticed something was wrong and asked if Eleanor was ill. Eleanor said she was fine, just tired. Thomas watched her carefully, making sure she did not try to contact Marcus or warn him about the additional men at the boundary. Eleanor did neither. She had no way to reach Marcus without being seen, and she suspected Thomas had taken precautions against interference. All she could do was wait. Grace also knew something terrible was coming. Marcus had told her about the hunt, about the terms, about his slim chances of survival. Grace begged him to run immediately, to leave before the hunt, and take his chances in the woods. Marcus refused. Running would only make things worse. They would track him down and kill him, and probably kill Eleanor too for helping him escape. At least the hunt gave him some small chance, and it would end Eleanor's immediate danger. Thomas had promised to keep Eleanor's secret if Marcus participated. If Marcus ran, that promise was void. On the evening of November 22nd, the participants began arriving at Ashford Plantation. They came in pairs and small groups, riding horses or arriving in carriages, men from throughout Caroline County and beyond. Thomas greeted them warmly, offered drinks and dinner, treated the gathering like a social event. The men were excited, looking forward to the hunt with an enthusiasm that made Eleanor physically ill. These were not cruel men by the standards of their society. They were normal plantation owners and overseers, men who attended church and had families and considered themselves good Christians. They simply did not view Marcus as fully human, and so hunting him was sport rather than murder. Dinner lasted for hours. The men ate and drank and talked about hunting experiences, comparing stories about tracking deer and bear and other game. Thomas eventually steered the conversation to the next morning's hunt, explaining the rules clearly. Marcus would be released at midnight, with a 1-hour head start. He would need to reach the northern boundary, marked clearly with white flags, before dawn. The hunters would pursue on foot, no horses, to keep the challenge fair. They would be armed with rifles, hunting knives, and whatever else they chose to carry. The goal was to stop Marcus before he reached the boundary. How they stopped him was left to individual discretion. Eleanor sat through the dinner in silence, forcing herself to eat small amounts so as not to draw attention. She watched the men laughing and drinking and preparing for the hunt. She hated them. She hated Thomas most of all, and she hated herself for not finding a way to stop this, for not being brave enough or clever enough to save Marcus from what was coming. At 11 o'clock, the men began preparing. They changed into hunting clothes, checked their weapons, gathered supplies. Eleanor changed as well, putting on a plain dress suitable for walking through woods, sturdy boots, and a heavy cloak. Thomas provided her with a rifle, making sure she knew how to load and fire it. Eleanor had been taught to shoot as a child, a common skill for women on isolated plantations who might need to defend their homes. She knew how to handle the weapon. At 11:30, the group walked to the cabin. Marcus was waiting outside. He had been told to be ready. He was dressed in simple clothing, no coat despite the cold November night. Thomas had forbidden giving Marcus any supplies, no food, no water, no tools. He would run with nothing but what he was wearing. Thomas explained the rules again, making sure Marcus understood. 1-hour head start, reach the northern boundary before dawn, marked with white flags, 4 miles through the woods. Simple enough. Marcus nodded. He looked at Eleanor once, just for a moment. his expression communicating everything they could not say aloud. Then he turned and walked into the darkness. The woods swallowed him. Thomas checked his pocket watch. Midnight, exactly. The head start had begun. The hunters settled in to wait. Some sat on logs near the cabin. Others stood talking in low voices. Thomas remained standing, his rifle across his arms, watching the tree line where Marcus had disappeared. Eleanor stood apart from the group, trying to control her shaking. It was cold, but that was not why she was shaking. The hour passed slowly. Some men dozed. Others continued talking, discussing strategy, planning how they would spread out to cover the most territory. Thomas had maps showing the terrain, the streams and ravines that Marcus would need to cross. He explained that Marcus would probably try to move east or west initially, avoiding the straight northern path that would be most heavily watched. They would need to sweep in a broad pattern, closing in from multiple directions. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Thomas checked his watch and nodded. Time. The hunters formed up into a loose line, spaced about 50 yards apart. They would move north together, maintaining communication through occasional calls, adjusting their pattern based on signs of Marcus's passage. Thomas positioned Eleanor in the center of the line, with experienced hunters on either side of her. He did not trust her to hunt effectively, but he needed her present and participating, needed her complicit in what was about to happen. The hunt began. The hunters moved into the woods, rifles ready, eyes adjusting to the darkness. There was some moonlight filtering through the bare November trees, enough to see by one's eyes adjusted. The woods were relatively quiet. Small animal sounds, the rustle of wind through remaining leaves, the crunch of boots on frost-hardened ground. The hunters moved slowly, checking for signs, broken branches, disturbed leaves, tracks in softer soil near streams. They found the first clear signs of Marcus's passage about half a mile from the cabin. Tracks near a stream crossing, fresh marks where someone had slipped on the muddy bank. The hunters adjusted their pattern, angling east to follow the trail. One man called out that Marcus was moving fast, not trying to hide his tracks, just running. Another responded that Marcus would tire himself out that way, making him easier to catch when his strength gave out. Eleanor walked with the line, her rifle held loosely, her mind screaming. She could not do this, could not participate in hunting Marcus like an animal, but what choice did she have? If she refused, if she broke from the line and tried to help Marcus, the other hunters would stop her. Thomas would ensure it. And Marcus would still die, with Eleanor having accomplished nothing except proving she was unwilling to make the choice Thomas had forced on her. 2 miles into the hunt, they found a place where Marcus had rested briefly. Tracks showed he had sat against a tree, probably catching his breath. The hunters estimated he was about 30 minutes ahead of them, moving slower now. Thomas ordered the line to increase speed. They needed to close the distance before Marcus recovered his strength. At 3 o'clock in the morning, they heard something. Movement ahead. The sound of someone pushing through underbrush. The hunters froze, listening. Then Thomas gave a signal, and the line broke into a run. They crashed through the woods toward the sound, no longer worried about stealth. If Marcus was that close, they needed speed, not silence. But it was not Marcus. It was a deer, startled by the hunters, and bounding away through the trees. The hunters slowed, breathing hard, frustrated by the false alarm. Thomas re-established the line, and they continued north, more carefully now. They found Marcus at 4:15 in the morning. He had reached a ravine, steep-sided and about 20 feet deep, with a stream running through the bottom. Marcus had climbed down into the ravine and was trying to climb the far side, but the bank was slick mud, and he kept sliding back down. The hunters spread out along the top of the ravine, looking down at Marcus, who finally stopped climbing and turned to face them. He was exhausted. His clothes were torn from pushing through underbrush. His hands were bleeding from multiple small cuts. He was breathing hard, visibly struggling to stay on his feet. But his expression was calm. He was not begging or pleading. He was simply standing there, waiting to see what would happen next. Thomas called down to him, "You gave us a good chase, Marcus. Better than I expected. But this is the end. You are, 2 miles from the boundary? Maybe a bit more? You will not make it before dawn." Marcus did not respond. He just stood there, looking up at the 12 men arranged along the ravine's edge. Thomas raised his rifle, taking aim. "This should be quick," he said, "out of respect for the chase you gave us." Eleanor stepped forward before she consciously decided to do it. She raised her own rifle, aiming at Marcus. Thomas glanced at her, surprised. Eleanor spoke, her voice steady despite everything. "If anyone kills him, it should be me. He is my responsibility, my mistake. I should be the one to finish it." Thomas studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. Do it, then." Eleanor sighted along the rifle barrel. Her hands were steady. Her mind was clear. She could end this. She could kill Marcus quickly, a single shot to the head, merciful compared to what the other hunters might do. Or she could miss deliberately, give Marcus a few more seconds, though what good those seconds would do she could not imagine. She took a breath. Marcus looked up at her. Their eyes met. And in that moment, some understanding passed between them, something Eleanor would spend the rest of her life trying to interpret. She pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the ravine. Marcus jerked and fell. The hunters cheered, congratulating Eleanor on her shot, but Thomas held up a hand for silence. He peered down into the ravine. Marcus was moving, trying to get up. Eleanor had hit him, but not fatally. Blood was spreading across his left shoulder where the bullet had struck. Thomas nodded, satisfied. Good shot for wounding him. Now we finish this properly. What happened next depended on whose account you believed. Some of the hunters later claimed that Marcus attacked first, that he grabbed a rock and tried to fight back, forcing them to respond with lethal force. Others said Marcus tried to run, that he dragged himself up the ravine's slope one more time, and the hunters had to chase him down. The most reliable account, given by a hunter named Robert Kensington in a letter written 20 years later, said that Thomas ordered the hunters down into the ravine to finish Marcus by hand. No more gunshots, and that they had complied. What all accounts agreed on was that Marcus died in that ravine, and that his death was not quick. The hunters took their time. Thomas wanted Eleanor to watch, wanted her to see exactly what her relationship with Marcus had cost him. So she watched. She stood at the ravine's edge while 12 men did what they had come to do. Marcus lasted longer than anyone expected. Even wounded and exhausted, he fought. He fought until he had no strength left, until his body gave out completely. Then he fought some more. It took nearly an hour. By the time it was over, dawn was breaking. The hunters climbed out of the ravine, breathing hard, splattered with blood, satisfied with their work. Thomas approached Eleanor. "It is done. Your secret dies with him, and we never speak of this again. Agreed?" Eleanor said nothing. She was staring into the ravine at Marcus's body. Thomas gripped her arm, forcing her to look at him. "Agreed?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Agreed." The hunters made their way back to the cabin as the sun rose. They were in good spirits, energized by the hunt, already retelling favorite moments to each other. Eleanor walked behind them, silent and hollow. When they reached the cabin, Thomas announced that they would burn it, best to destroy any evidence that Marcus had been living there. The hunters piled furniture and anything flammable inside the structure, then set it ablaze. They stood watching as flames consumed the cabin where Eleanor and Marcus had spent 6 months building a life together. By noon, the hunters had all departed. They rode away to their own plantations, promising to gather again for the next hunt whenever Thomas organized one. Eleanor went to her room and stayed there for 3 days, not eating, not speaking, not responding when Victoria came to check on her. On the 4th day, she emerged, pale and gaunt but composed. She told Thomas she wanted to visit the ravine one more time, to ensure they had left no evidence. Thomas said he would send men to check the site, but Eleanor insisted. She needed to do it herself. Thomas reluctantly agreed. Eleanor walked to the ravine alone. When she reached it, she climbed down carefully, using roots and rocks for handholds. Marcus's body was still there. Thomas had said they would bury it, but apparently had not gotten around to it yet. Eleanor knelt beside Marcus, and for the first time since the hunt, she allowed herself to cry. She stayed there for hours, sitting beside his body, talking to him, apologizing, promising him things she knew she could never deliver. But eventually, she stopped crying. Something had changed inside her. The woman who had knelt beside Marcus's body was not the same woman who had pulled that trigger. That woman had been weak, had been controlled by fear and social pressure and concern for her reputation. This woman, the one who stood up from beside Marcus's body and climbed out of the ravine, was something else entirely. This woman had a purpose. This woman had a plan. This woman was going to make everyone involved pay for what they had done. She started with Thomas. Eleanor waited 3 weeks, long enough that no one would connect what came next with the hunt. Then she began a careful campaign of sabotage, small things at first. Plantation records that went missing, creating confusion about which workers were assigned where, tools that disappeared from workshops, shipments of tobacco that somehow ended up contaminated with mold, ruining batches that had been prepared for sale. Thomas blamed enslaved workers, blamed overseers, blamed everyone except Eleanor, who seemed to have retreated into quiet depression after her ordeal. But Eleanor was not depressed. She was planning. She spent her days observing the plantation, learning its patterns, identifying weaknesses, figuring out where she could apply pressure to cause maximum disruption. She spent her evenings in her room, writing detailed plans in coded language, preparing for the long campaign ahead. She also made contact with Grace. Marcus's sister was grieving, destroyed by the loss of her brother, but she was also angry. When Eleanor approached her privately and told her what she planned to do, Grace immediately agreed to help. The two women formed an unlikely alliance. Eleanor had resources and relative freedom of movement. Grace had knowledge of the enslaved community and access to networks Eleanor could never reach. Together, they began working toward a single goal. They would destroy everyone who had participated in Marcus's death. The campaign lasted 17 years. Some of what Eleanor and Grace did was direct. 2 of the hunters died in accidents that were not accidents. One drowned in his own mill pond after someone had sabotaged the wooden walkway, causing it to collapse at precisely the right moment. Another was thrown from his horse after something spooked the animal during a morning ride. Investigation revealed a snake had been placed in the saddlebag, though no one could explain how it had gotten there. Other revenge was more subtle. Eleanor and Grace spread rumors, carefully planted information that damaged reputations and destroyed business relationships. They sabotaged crops and equipment on the properties of men who had participated in the hunt. They arranged for legal troubles, forged documents that created complications with land titles and contracts. They also worked to free enslaved people from the plantations of the hunters. Grace had connections to the Underground Railroad, networks of people who helped enslaved people escape north. Eleanor provided money and information, identifying weak points in plantation security, creating opportunities for escapes. Over 17 years, Grace and Eleanor helped 83 people escape from plantations belonging to men who had hunted Marcus. Not all made it to freedom. Some were caught and returned, punished brutally. But many succeeded, and each successful escape was a small victory, a small piece of justice extracted from the system that had killed Marcus. Thomas was the primary target. Eleanor lived in his house for 17 years, a smiling presence who gradually dismantled everything he had built. She turned overseers against each other, created divisions among enslaved workers that disrupted productivity, made small changes to business practices that seemed reasonable, but were actually designed to cause long-term financial damage. By 1870, Ashford Plantation was failing. Thomas could not understand why. On paper, everything should have been working. But crops kept failing, workers were less productive, equipment kept breaking, shipments got delayed or lost. It was like the plantation itself was cursed. The Civil War provided additional opportunities. When Virginia seceded in 1861, Thomas joined the Confederate Army as an officer. He left Eleanor to manage the plantation in his absence, a decision that proved catastrophic for him. Eleanor immediately began freeing enslaved people, not officially, but effectively. She stopped pursuing runaways. She looked the other way when people disappeared. She made it known through Grace that anyone who wanted to leave would not be stopped. By 1863, half the enslaved population had fled. Thomas returned home on leave to find his labor force decimated, and Eleanor claiming she had no idea why so many had run away. Thomas survived the war but came home broken in 1865. The plantation was in ruins. Confederate currency was worthless. Most of the enslaved workers were gone, and those who remained were now legally free and demanding wages Thomas could not pay. Within 2 years, Thomas was forced to sell most of the land just to pay debts. By 1868, Ashford Plantation had been reduced to 200 acres and the main house. Thomas became bitter and withdrawn, drinking heavily, raging about how everything had been taken from him. He never knew Eleanor was responsible. She had been so subtle, so patient, spreading the damage over so many years that no single incident could be traced back to her. She was simply his unmarried sister, the loyal family member who had stayed with him through the war and its aftermath, who managed what remained of the household, who kept everything from falling apart completely. Thomas pitied her, stuck taking care of him, wasting her life on a failed plantation. Thomas died in 1872 at age 48, his body worn out by alcohol and stress and bitterness. At the funeral, Eleanor stood dry-eyed beside his grave. She felt nothing. The man who had forced her to hunt Marcus was dead, and she had orchestrated his slow destruction over nearly 2 decades. It was not enough. It would never be enough, but it was something. Grace died in 1874, her body exhausted from years of dangerous work, helping enslaved people escape and coordinating revenge operations with Eleanor. On her deathbed, Grace made Eleanor promise to continue the work, to keep fighting until everyone involved in Marcus's death had paid. Eleanor promised. By 1874, 7 of the 12 hunters were dead, either from direct action or from the indirect consequences of Eleanor and Grace's long campaign. The remaining 5 lived in fear. They knew something was happening. Too many accidents, too many business failures, too many problems that seemed to center on men who had participated in that hunt back in 1853. They suspected Eleanor might be involved, but they could not prove anything. And even if they could prove it, what would they do? Prosecute a wealthy white woman for property damage and rumor spreading? No judge would take it seriously. So they lived with growing paranoia, waiting for whatever was coming next. Eleanor died in 1888, at age 63. She had never married. She had spent the last 16 years of her life living alone in what remained of Ashford Plantation, supported by income from renting out farmland and by investments she had made carefully over the years. When she died, she left a substantial estate, most of which went to charitable organizations that supported freed slaves and worked for racial justice. She also left behind a sealed letter to be opened only after the death of the last surviving hunter. That last hunter died in 1891. The letter was opened by an attorney, and its contents were shocking enough that he brought it to local authorities. Eleanor's letter contained a full confession. She described the hunt, named all 12 participants, detailed what they had done to Marcus in that ravine. She also described her 17-year campaign of revenge, listing each incident, explaining her methods, implicating herself in 2 direct murders, and countless other acts of sabotage and destruction. The letter created a scandal. Some people refused to believe it, claiming Eleanor must have been insane, that her letter was the delusional fantasy of a bitter old woman. Others believed every word, but argued that no prosecution was possible since Eleanor and most of the perpetrators were dead. A few argued that the case should be investigated, that the truth about what happened in 1853 should be formally documented, but no investigation ever occurred. The families of the hunters were still powerful. They used their influence to suppress the story, to keep Eleanor's letter from being widely publicized. The letter itself disappeared from official records shortly after being opened. Some claimed it was destroyed. Others believed it was hidden away by one of the families to prevent it from ever being used against them. The story survived in fragments. Local historians knew something had happened involving Eleanor Ashford and a hunt on plantation property in the 1850s. Descendants of Grace told the story in their families, passing down what their ancestor had done to avenge her brother. And a few elderly people who had been enslaved at Ashford Plantation gave testimony to historians in the early 1900s, describing what they remembered about Marcus and Eleanor and the revenge campaign that followed Marcus's death. In 1927, during demolition of the old Ashford mansion, which had stood empty for decades, workers found a leather-bound book hidden in a sealed cavity behind a bedroom wall. The book was a journal, handwritten, containing detailed accounts of 7 hunts conducted at various Virginia plantations between 1848 and 1856. The journal appeared to have been kept by someone who attended these hunts regularly, documenting each one with dates, locations, participants, and descriptions of what occurred. The entry for November 23, 1853, described the hunt for Marcus in detail. It matched Eleanor's letter exactly, confirming that she had not been delusional or exaggerating. The hunt had happened. The torture had happened. Everything Eleanor claimed was true. The journal also revealed that Thomas Ashford had not invented the idea of the hunt. He had been invited to participate in such hunts before, attending at least 3 at other plantations. The hunt for Marcus was simply Thomas's first time organizing one on his own property. The journal was given to the Caroline County Historical Society. Historians examined it, verified that it appeared authentic, and debated what to do with it. Some argued it should be published, that this dark aspect of Virginia history needed to be acknowledged. Others argued that publishing it would cause unnecessary pain to descendants of everyone involved. The debate continued for several years. Then, in 1934, the journal disappeared from the Historical Society's archives. No one admitted to taking it. No one knew where it went. It simply vanished. Some believed it was destroyed by descendants of the hunters who did not want this history made public. Others thought it might have been stolen by collectors of dark historical artifacts. A few speculated that it was hidden away somewhere, waiting to be rediscovered when enough time had passed that its contents would be less incendiary. The ravine where Marcus died is still there. It is on private property now, part of a farm that has changed hands many times since the 1850s. The current owners probably do not know what happened there. Local historians know the approximate location, but the exact spot where Marcus's body was found has been lost to time. There are no markers, no memorials, nothing to indicate that a man died there after being hunted like an animal by 12 men who considered themselves civilized and Christian. Grace is buried in a small cemetery near the remains of Ashford Plantation. Her grave is marked with a simple stone that gives her name and dates, nothing more. But people who know the story leave flowers there sometimes, small tributes to a woman who spent her life fighting against the system that killed her brother. Eleanor is buried in the Ashford family plot beside her brother Thomas. The irony would have amused her. She spent 17 years destroying him, and now they lie side by side for eternity. Her gravestone describes her as beloved sister and faithful daughter, phrases that reveal nothing about who she actually was or what she actually did. This mystery shows us that love and cruelty are not opposites, but can exist in the same person at the same time. Eleanor loved Marcus enough to risk everything for him. She also pulled the trigger that wounded him and watched while 12 men finished what she had started. Then she spent 17 years avenging him, becoming as calculated and methodical in her revenge as Thomas had been in organizing the hunt. What do you think of this story? Was Eleanor a victim forced into impossible choices, or was she complicit in Marcus's death regardless of the pressure she faced? Did her 17 years of revenge balance the scales, or was she simply perpetuating more violence? Leave your comment below and let us know your thoughts about this disturbing chapter in Virginia history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into America's darkest secrets, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our explorations of the stories they do not teach in schools. Share this video with someone who appreciates historical mysteries that challenge what we think we know about the past. And remember, the truth is often more disturbing than fiction, and history holds secrets that continue to shape us whether we acknowledge them or not. See you in the next video.